Are you suffering from hip pain in the front of your hip when you go into a bend or a squat position? It's not your tight hip flexors, so stop stretching them out. Stick around, I'll tell you exactly what's causing your hip pain and how you can fix it. What's up guys, it's Alex here from Hexa Health Hub, and today we're talking about anterior hip pain, or hip pain at the front of your hip when you go into a bend and a squat movement. Now, a lot of the time people think that anterior hip pain is caused by tight hip flexors, so they're constantly spending time stretching out your hip flexor, which doesn't end up helping the problem. If I think of this blue band as being my hip flexor, so it runs down the front of my hip crest into the top of my thigh, if that's tight and I go into a hip flexion position or a squat, the band gets put on slack. When I stand up, it's tighter. Back on slack, and it's back tighter. So it doesn't make sense then, if my hip flexor is tight and I go into a hip flexion position, taking slack off that muscle, it doesn't make sense for that to be the thing that's causing our pinching pain in the front of our hip. What does make sense, however, is if the glutes are tight, that can have an effect when we go into a hip flexion position. Let me show you what I mean. If we think of this band now as being my glute tissue, runs from the back of the hip crest into the back of my thigh bone. If that's a little bit tight in my glutes and now I go into a hip flexion position or a squat, it puts the band on more tension, puts the muscle on more tension. What happens if your glutes get put on more tension when you go into a hip flexion position? That tension through your glute tissue, as I go deeper into my forward bend or deeper into my squat, that pressure on that tension on that muscle shifts my thigh bone forward into the front of my hip socket. If I'm getting pressure now into the front of my hip socket, that's that sensation of that pinching as I go down into my squat movement. So the problem ends up being with your glutes, not your hip flexors. So now we know what the problem is, why does it happen, and then how do we fix it? So why does this happen? Most of the time your muscles get tight when they're weak. The reason being is your muscles' function is to create stability across a joint when you're moving and completing your activities. If your body thinks that you don't have enough strength to create stability across that joint when you're doing your activity, it goes, oh, we don't have enough strength to control ourselves. We've got all this movement here. We're probably going to hurt ourselves. How do we fix that? We're going to tighten everything up. And with that tension we've created, that's going to create stability now. This isn't a good long-term solution because, like we've just explained, it can cause other issues to happen, such as pinching in the front of your hip. If we then go and loosen off your glutes, that might help you temporarily to decrease some of those symptoms, but your body goes, oh, you've just loosened off something I'm deliberately trying to keep tight, and it, you guessed it, tightens back up again. So if you forever become into this perpetual loop of loosen, tightens back up again, loosens, tightens back up again. So what you need to do is, you can go away and do your mobility work and you're loosening off to try and settle your symptoms. As soon as your symptoms settle, you then need to be moving into a strengthening plan for your glute tissue. What then happens is, over time, you're building up that glute strength in the background while you're doing your loosening to keep your symptoms down. All of a sudden you'll get to a point where you'll loosen your hip, you've built enough strength in the background that then your body goes, oh, you've loosened my hip now, we've got enough strength to create stability when we need it now, so we're going to contract and create stability with the strength that we now have, and when we're not doing activity, now we can loosen off. Make sense? Good. So if you're someone who's been suffering with hip pain for a long time and you've done all the stretches in the world and it's just not fixing it, send me a message and we'll put you on the right path and give you all the correct strengthening exercises you need to be doing for your hips to fix this hip pain long term for good.